Guys, it is time for a Cow's Opinion, where I go over the latest, greatest, and a little bit of hope today. It's not all bad news on this channel. It's not all bad news. It's a lot of bad news because it seems like that's the kind of thing we're in post-pandemic with all these games coming out and now all these delayed things and big studios. But hey, maybe there's a good choice coming up. Guys, this is a Cow's Opinion. We go over the latest and greatest information, so make sure to let us know what you think. Conversation is yours down below. And today I want to talk about a game series I love so much that we actually had an interview about recently called DeadSpace. If you don't know what DeadSpace is, it's amazing. And the first game was recently remade by EA in all its beautiful, scary, spine-tingling glory. If you've never played it before, it's fun. If you have played it before, it's still a lot of fun. I mean, the jump scares and everything, it's pretty much, it's an improvement, but a lot of it is like better graphics, better storytelling, better balance, but you know, the scares, the bosses, everything are still there. So it's not like you're going to be massively surprised by it. Still, it is fantastic. And recently, Chuck Beaver, who is the story producer of the original Dead Space, has said that he would like to do Dead Space 3 and would like to redo it completely. Almost. Practically. Literally toss everything out, redo it. And we'll get to why in a Cow's Opinion that's a good idea in a second. So he wasn't just the story producer for all the games. He also did its spin-offs, its various comics and novels, its animated movies, guys. This was the man who was in charge of the entire universe, making sure that that story stayed on point. For the most part, I think Mr. Chuck did a good job. So he recently had an interview with the YouTuber Captain Brebo, and he explained why he didn't like Dead Space 3 and also why he thought it didn't do very well. So, first of all, if you don't know, Dead Space 1 and 2 are single-player, horror-driven suspense games where you have limited resources. You know what survival horror is. You have limited resources. You have to survive. You have to craft, solve the mysteries, make your stuff, do things, figure out what resources you're going to put towards what points, and hopefully they don't nibble on your giblets. Dead Space 3 took a massive turn that surprised everybody. It was co-op, it was massive exploration, it wasn't really scary, there was a big more focus on just like run and gun style play. Instead of fighting just necromorphs, you're also fighting these weird terrorists who somehow overthrew all of humanity. There were some weird decisions made. But Beaver goes in and he talks about that in this interview. So when people are asking what the hell happened, he said there's a return on investment number that has to be hit. So there were some calculated risks that we all made that we thought would do it, and it didn't work out. Now, he's referring to why Dead Space 3 is so thematically different. And they go on to point out that, you know, a lot more people want to play action and adventure than they do survival horror. Even now, survival horror, especially recently, has been really profitable and great. Don't get me wrong. I love a good survival horror game. But I'm also not stupid enough that there's just a bigger audience right now and back in when Dead Space 3 came out for more action and adventure. I mean, it's almost inaugural at this point because the cap seems to be around 2 million people who are really wanting to see it. And when you point, now 2 million people sounds like a lot, but he lets you know it's literally nothing when you take into consideration time, treasure, and there's always the 3 T's. I love to talk about the 3 T's from that military man's book. To do anything, you have to put your talent, which is your abilities, your time, which is of course your time, and your treasure, which is, you know, your money. And it take 2 million in sales is a lot, but EA who owns Dead Space is a big company, and they would like to see their universally loved franchise hit more than just 2 million players like Dead Space 1 and 2 did. So because of this, they decided above Beaver and other people's heads that it's not going to be just single-player survival horror game, but will also incorporate new ideas to bring in a larger audience. That in itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but in this case, it ultimately led to the game's downfall. If you know, Dead Space 3 was the last Dead Space we got. The franchise just died. It had comics, it had novels, it had animated movies that I loved, it had video games, and Dead Space 3 came out, and everyone was like, I don't like this anymore. The plan was that we would expand into other gameplay genres and stuff. And I think that all those bits together not only didn't generate a new audience, they lost the old audience. It's exactly what happened. I can tell you, if you were playing with a friend on the co-op thing, you still had a pretty fun time. But doing stuff with your friends is always better than doing it alone, like 99 times out of 100. So now you need a friend. It's not necessarily what people wanted from their single-player survival horror narrative-driven game. The gun mechanic, the recrafting, we missed a lot of the stuff that everybody loved about the old one, and then created a whole bunch of exploration space. We were on a big, wide open planet because of that, and all these decisions had lots of follow-on. And then co-op, the hits just kept coming. It's like, what? Co-op? So, yeah. The gun mechanic is you used to have to, like, tear off the limbs of the necromorphs to fight them. It wasn't like aiming for the head or the body like other games. But this one went more run and gun. And there was you could make like dozens of weapons in this game, which is kind of cool. Except that Dead Space 1 and 2 had just a few guns, but they were all really useful and well thought of. These were just like, hey, now you take this part of this gun and this part of this gun, you craft it, you got this combo gun, alright! But, I mean, it was like Gears of War without the cover system, which is not necessarily what you want, by the way. And then, like he says, everyone was like, what do you mean co-op? Now, they tried to do a good job with Dead Space 3. The characters would have different experiences. One of them seemed to be freaking out, and they don't really talk about this article, but the story was not that great either. It wasn't really clear on what was happening from time to time. But that's when he was talking about, they just lost the direction because they tried to expand too much, and nobody really knew what kind of game they were making. We weren't allowed to make a horror game from the beginning, so Ben, who was creative director, and I were like, well, what are we making? If you look at it, it's a beautiful Drake's Uncharted game, an adventure with puzzles and set pieces. Kind of? I mean, it's definitely in the vein of Uncharted, but that's not really what... But when you hear the word Dead Space, it's not really what you want. You know? But like he said, EA was like, we love this franchise, it sells all this stuff, but we need more than a couple million players a game. All big AAA publishers, they don't want a couple of million. Eventually they want to grow that to like 10 million players or more. You want big money. He also stated that given the chance, he would completely revamp the project and focus on the ending of Dead Space 3 in which Isaac loses his mind. I would just start from complete scratch, and I would make this about the end of Dead Space 2. He's broken, and now this is the adventure of Isaac in Dead Space 3. Broken Isaac. He tried to do the thing, tried to do the truth, it broke him, and now we're in the consequences of him being broken. I would make it like a Tyler Durden thing, an unreliable narrator, where you're like, what happened? And the player maybe doesn't even know. Isaac certainly doesn't know. So what's my opinion on this? I love Dead Space, guys. It was not a garbage game by any means, don't get me wrong, but it was a really good lesson in maybe when you want to expand a game's audience, your main line shouldn't change drastically. Now, this goes back to the whole Final Fantasy thing, but Final Fantasy 16, while a massive departure from 1, is not a huge departure from 15, which is not a massive departure from... you build up on the stuff that you've made. And that's not saying you have to have 15 Dead Spaces before you can have the kind of gameplay that Dead Space 3 had, but your core audience was for horror. If you had still managed to deliver on that, your core audience would have stayed with you. But what happened was they tried to go in so many different directions with so many different things. They admitted, well, even at times we weren't quite sure what we were doing. And they didn't bring in new audiences because new audiences like, well, that's a scary game thing. And I know you're running around and shooting things, but it's not doing it any better than any of the other dozens and dozens of action-adventure games. I'm not trying to insult Dead Space 3 here. And the core gamers were like, it's not a scary game anymore. I want to play a scary game. I'm going to go play this scary game. I'm not going to play this. And that's what killed the franchise originally. EA basically just thought they could have their cake and eat it too. Guys, we'll get rid of all the horror, but those 2 million people still love Dead Space, so they'll definitely be on board. And now we're going to get lots and lots of new people with this. But again, when you took out the survival horror, they are correct. The market for action-adventure games is much bigger than the market for horror games. But those horror game players don't necessarily want to play an action-adventure. So they thought they were starting with 2 million in sales. But they were really, it was basically just a new version, new game with just the same world building and everything. And so they were actually starting from zero and they didn't know it. And because of that, I remember seeing YouTube videos and message boards and all kinds of stuff talk about, not my Dead Space, I don't want to play this, this isn't what I want. And so they lost that, and it just didn't stand. It wasn't a bad game by any means, but it wasn't going to blow anybody's mind as the next great run and gun shooter or anything like that, guys. So, like he says in this, they need to redo Dead Space 3 almost completely. The success of the remake of Dead Space 1 has revitalized the franchise. I think it's time to start going back to your world building. You can do 2, and then with 3, you can do the survival, scary horror game you always wanted to do. Because like Beaver says, right here, it's like we weren't allowed to make a horror game from the beginning. It's not the people who made Dead Space's fault. They weren't allowed to continue to make scary games. They were told you got to make something with mass market appeal. But that's not what the faithful felt betrayed, and the new audience just didn't materialize because, again, not a bad game. Just wasn't a 10 out of 10 blow you away game, which is probably what they needed to replace the millions that they lost. So guys, you know what you can do. You can like, comment, and subscribe on this video. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, but most importantly of all, comment down below. Have you ever played Dead Space? I'm not talking just the remake that came out recently. Did you play any of the original trilogy? Did you play Extraction, Sabotage, and Ignition? Did you see the movies? Have you ever experienced Dead Space? Did you like it? And let me know if you're happy. I'm guessing there's not a lot of Dead Space 3 stands out there. There might be a couple. Let me know if you're happy that if they get to do Dead Space 3, it's hopefully going to get redone completely, because it honestly needs to. It's just not going. It's not what you need to carry the franchise forward. You can do action adventure. It would make a great side game. But people wanted that core horror vibe, and it just wasn't there. But you know what is there? The fact that you can play more games. Hi, you knew I was going to get you, because games are awesome and you deserve awesome. That is your Monday. It is freaking cold here where I am. It's 40, warmed up to 49. It was below freezing. Next week it's going to be in the 80s. I love Texas. I'll see you next time.